Our text today is Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. So we're going to deal this morning with one of the most iconic teachings of Jesus in what's undoubtedly the most iconic sermon of Jesus. So we're talking love for your enemies out of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's part of this series that we're in right now. This is only the second week of the series, but we're talking about cultural crossroads. And we're asking two questions in this series. The first one is, why are we so divided? Like politically, culturally, theologically, sociologically, like it seems like, and culture wars have raged for years, okay? So we're not the first generation to deal with the culture wars, but they seem particularly intense right now. Very polarizing times that we're living in, very divided times that we're living in. We're asking why. The answer to that question, we say, has something to do with these four things right here. The rise of fear, the demonization of our enemies, the glorification of our politics, and the loss of community. And so what we're doing in this series is we're taking each one of those one at a time and kind of talking through them. The more important question is, what are we going to do about the division? Like, how should we respond to division? As believers, as followers of Jesus, how does Jesus call us to respond to the culture wars? How does he call us to respond to division and polarizing times? And like, is there a better way forward? And of course there is. If you're following Jesus, that's always a better way forward. So how do we pursue the better way forward and not the norms of this world? And so today we're talking through the second one of those, the demonization of our enemies. The rise of fear was last week. It's on YouTube if you missed that one and you want to pick that up. But we're talking through the demonization of our enemies, and Jesus just happens to address this directly in the Sermon on the Mount. So I want to read it, talk a few notes just about what he says. It's really not hard to understand. He says what he means what he says. So it's really not hard to understand. It's hard to apply. So we're going to spend most of the sermon this morning on the application of this teaching. But let's receive the teaching first. So Matthew 5, 43 and 45 says, "You've heard that it was said," and this is Jesus speaking, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Continuing in verse 46, "If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, a few notes about what he's saying here. This is a section of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is taking teachings from what we call the Old Testament. They would have just called it the Scriptures. It was the Hebrew Scriptures. He's taking teaching from the Old Testament and he's elevating the meaning. He's saying, you've heard it said, but I tell you. So he takes a teaching from the Old Testament that really only half of it is in the Old Testament. So he says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. That comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. And Leviticus 19:18 is actually about not seeking revenge or not retaliating against somebody who's done you harm. And the rule is, do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And this is a series of instructions that God has given to the people of Israel. And it's very clear instruction right here. This reminds us of what Jesus said about turn the other cheek, because this is kind of the same concept, what Jesus said about turn the other cheek. So the Bible does say in the Old Testament, love your neighbor as yourself. But you'll notice in there, it says, don't bear a grudge against anyone among your people. So it was kind of a loophole, if you wanted to, that you could interpret this as, well, God calls us to love our neighbors and hate our enemies. Now, the Old Testament Scriptures never says hate your enemies, but that was the traditional Jewish interpretation. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. That's the traditional American interpretation. Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Matter of fact, I wanted to do a social experiment this week and post on Facebook, the Bible says, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And just to see how many likes I got. See how many shares I got. See how many people said, amen. The Bible does say it. Because we're so accustomed to hating our enemies that we assume the Bible does say that. Because that's just the way we've been taught to interpret that particular passage. Jesus turns that on its head and says, I call you to love your neighbors and your enemy. Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. And he takes the whole ethic and flips it around on its head. You know, if you love those, only love those who love you in return, what good is that? Anybody can do that. The tax collectors are doing that. And that, like we read this part of Matthew, that's not a big deal to us, but Jesus says really controversial stuff right there. And it's really not controversial. It's kind of like he's taking a jab at them. Like, you think you're good just because you love people that love you in return? Come on, tax collectors do that. The tax collectors were a hated group of people within that society because they were considered traitors to the Jewish people. They were working with the Roman. Now, nobody loves tax collectors, right? So we still don't love tax collectors, but we don't love tax collectors because we don't like paying taxes. Not because we think, well, they're morally corrupt and evil, but they thought, you know, the tax collectors morally corrupt. They're traitors to the Jewish people because they're working with the Romans. And so then the other one is Jesus says, if you greet only your own people, if you're kind only to your own people, then what's special about that? The pagans do that. He's talking about the Romans there. And the Romans were probably even more hated than the tax collectors because the Romans were the oppressors in this. They were oppressing the Jewish people. So anytime you see Jesus talking about love for your neighbor, I think it's interesting. He intentionally points to specific people groups that they didn't feel like they had to love. So when he says love your neighbor, he's expanding the definition of neighbor. They had a very narrow view of what neighbor was included. So love your neighbor as yourself. Oh yeah, no trouble. I can love my neighbor as myself. Neighbor is anybody who loves me in return and anybody who's part of my own people group. And Jesus says, no, your neighbor includes the Samaritans. Your neighbor includes the tax collectors. Your neighbor includes the Roman pagans. Your neighbor includes the enemies. Your neighbor it includes everybody. So Jesus takes this ethical standard of love, and that's what he's doing throughout the Sermon on the Mount. He says, I just don't want you to just love your neighbors. I want you to love everybody. Love even your enemies. And he ends by saying, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. In English, we hear that as make no mistakes. That's what perfection means. Or we hear it as be flawless as your heavenly Father is flawless. That's not what the Greek means. The Greek is a little bit deeper. Perfect is still a good word, but the Greek is about be complete or be mature. So this is about he's calling his disciples to be mature up into the way of love that God is calling you into, to be complete in the way that you love. Don't just love partially. Don't just love a few people. Be complete in the way that you love. So that's what it means. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? The question is, how do we apply it to today? Like, how do we, especially in a world that encourages us to do the exact opposite? Like a world where it's perfectly acceptable to hate your enemies. That is a perfectly acceptable thing to do, is to hate your enemies. In a world where we're so quick to label anyone who disagrees with us as an enemy and then demonize them in such a way to create distrust and division. And I'll be honest, as I'm working through this, I was trying to figure out whether I call this message the demonization of our enemies or the dehumanization of our enemies. Because there's examples of both throughout world history. And I was trying to figure out, like, which is the bigger issue in 2026? And we can have an argument about this, not right now, because I'm talking. We can have an argument after services. But we can debate about this, which is the bigger issue, demonization or dehumanization. But I want to tell you kind of why I decided to call it demonization. So the difference between the two, demonization cast our enemies as evil. Right? The tax collectors were demonized by the Jewish people because they were considered evil or traitors or morally corrupt. That's dehumanizing, that's demonizing language. And we do have enemies of that nature. Right? We have enemies who are evil, or enemies who are, morally corrupt, enemies who may want to harm us in some way. Of course, I think the interesting part about it is Jesus famously called one of those enemies, a tax collector, to be his disciple, and his book just happens to be the book that we're reading about what it means to love your enemies. So Jesus always takes things and flips it on their head. Dehumanization is when we say our enemies are not just evil, they are less than human. They're dogs, they're vermin, they're scum, they're cockroaches, they're lice, they're filth, they're savages, they're barbarians, they're infidels, whatever. I mean, there's all sorts of dehumanizing language that's been used throughout world history. And say this clearly, we do not have enemies of that nature. We do not. Every single person is created in the image of God, and therefore every single person deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. That doesn't mean we can't hold them accountable for their actions. That doesn't mean that we can't enact justice if somebody has done wrong, but justice must be enacted in a humane way that recognizes basic human rights. That's the ethic of Jesus. And we should never dehumanize, because there's been some horrific tragedies that have taken place throughout history because we moved from language of demonization to language of dehumanization. And the Jewish Holocaust is probably the strongest example of that. That was not that long ago. That the German people, or excuse me, not the German people, the German government, we need to be able to separate people from governments, okay? The people are not always complicit with the government. You can apply that to today as well with our enemies. But the German government was able to cast the Jews as less than human. And that allowed the German people to kind of shrug their shoulders when their property's taken and they're loaded up on train cars and they're shipped off to concentration camps, because they're not even human beings. In America, slavery is probably the closest example that we can get to, because there was all sorts of atrocities that happened during the period of slavery, and that's not that long ago either. Like, we still have people who are alive that remember a Holocaust. We're losing that generation very quickly, but there are still people living today that remember Holocaust. There's nobody alive that remembers slavery, but we're not that many generations removed from it. And it was justified by Christian people because we used dehumanizing language against Africans to say they're not really human. We treated them as property. And so you can see how dangerous dehumanization is and why it is always wrong and always evil, because we justify atrocity through that. And so we have to be careful about dehumanization. But as I started thinking about modern examples, like I wanted to bring it into 2026 and say, what's a modern example of dehumanization? And I struggled a little bit to come up with one. They do exist, all right? But and I'm going to give you my opinion on two things. And like I said, you can disagree with me, that's okay. But my opinion on two things. One is, I think we've come a long way from the period of slavery, and even from the period of the 1940s with segregation and the Holocaust and all these things that are happening. I think as a country we've come a long way, and we've corrected a lot of mistakes. Overt and explicit dehumanizing language is still around, but not as much. And usually when it is practiced, it is quickly called out and condemned. There's usually people that quickly say, that's wrong, we shouldn't be using that kind of language, that's immoral, stop. All right? That's good. That's good. I think we've improved in the area of dehumanizing language. Demonizing language is not only accepted, we cheer it. We share it. We like it. I mean, like that. Like it's become. I think it's increased in the modern era. And I may be wrong about that. I may just be thinking that way because I spend too much time on social media, particularly Facebook. I'm no longer on Twitter, which is now X, but I think it's just as bad. Those are the two worst ones when it comes to seeing demonizing language. So you regularly see people post things on X and Facebook that demonizes their enemies. Maybe not even their enemies, just people they happen to disagree with. That cast them in a particular light. And I'm seeing that happen more and more. And that's why I called this one the demonization of our enemies. Because I think that one is the real problem we've got within our society. And that is the problem that we as Christians have to stand up and say, wait a minute, this is not right. We shouldn't be doing this. Jesus calls us to a different ethical standard when it comes to our enemies. Jesus calls us to a different ethical standard when it comes to those who just disagree with us. And that's the irony of it. A lot of what I see on Facebook is we're not demonizing our enemies. They're not even our enemy. They just disagree with us. That's it. They got one idea, we got another idea, and so we cast them as demons and enemies and corrupt and evil and vile and wrong and all this kind of stuff. And I'll give you an example. And I debated a long time, longer than I probably should have, but I debated a long time on which example to use because I wanted to use a national example, as it happens all the time within our nation, and to the point that we've kind of become immune to it in some way. And the national disheartens me as well, but what really disheartens me is when it becomes localized, when it's happening to people I know, that I go to church with, that I go to the gym with and work out together, or that I see at the ballpark, or my kids go to school together with them. When it's happening locally, I find it really, really disheartening. And it's been happening locally for a while now. And I'll give you an example. And it goes back to, this was like 2022 or 2023, somewhere in there. I was involved in the Murray Alliance, which is the Chamber of Commerce Economic Development. Murray Alliance. I was on the board of directors for that. And somewhere along that time period, Murray County was named as the fastest growing county in the state of Tennessee. And we were happy about it. Like I remember on the chamber, because the chamber's about creating jobs, creating opportunities for business. Not like, we were happy, like, look at this. People love Murray County. This is a great county to live in. This is a great place. We're the greatest county in the state of Tennessee, and now we're #1 in growth. And so we were happy about it. If you go back and Google that this afternoon, there's all sorts of press releases about it. You see stuff in the Daily Herald, Main Street Murray. Everybody was happy about it. Well, now we're freaked out about it because now we're feeling the reality of what it means to be the fastest growing county in the state of Tennessee. And we're no longer, by the way, we're not even in the top 10 anymore, so we can relax a little bit. But now we're like, we went from being like, hey, this is Murray County, and we're happy, and we love our county, to going, hey, Rutherford County's great. Go check out Rutherford County. Go check out, Cheatham County. Like, there's all sorts of great counties in Middle Tennessee, somewhere else besides Murray County. And that's because we're feeling the strain and the pain of growth. And there's two sides of that. So there's a debate that takes place within our community. And the debate has to do with property rights. And so there's one side who says, listen, a property owner ought to be able to do what they want with their own property. They own the property. They ought to be able to receive the highest value of that. And that means if they want to develop it, they ought to be allowed to develop it. It's their property. And the other side says, no, wait a minute. You got to consider the community as a whole, because there's infrastructure and emergency services and education and all this kind of stuff. They should not be allowed to develop it. Even if they own it, it's not theirs to develop. You got to think of the whole community. All right? That's the two sides of the debate. And which side we fall on usually depends upon how far the development is from our house. So if the development's in my backyard, I'm right here. No, you can't develop that. But if it's, 15 miles away, I know, property owners do what they want with it. But this debate's been going on for years. This debate, 1986, those of you that were around in the late 80s in Murray County, there's a big old company that came to town, right? And so there was huge debates about who gets to allow, who can to do this, who can determine, all that kind of stuff. If you've ever been to a planning commission meeting, this is the debate at every single planning commission meeting. It's why the planning commission exists, to have a debate about property rights. It's the purpose of the commission, and it's good, and it's part of the democratic process, and it's a debate that we need to have. This is what's disheartening about it to me. I've recently seen people involved in that debate elevate it to not just saying, well, I have a difference of opinion about what somebody should be. I think you should do this, and I think you should do this. To elevate it to the point to say the other side is not just wrong about their plan for our community. They're evil. They're wrong. They're corrupt. They're greedy. They're in the pocket of some developer. They're trying to line their own pockets, or they don't care about the people of this community, and they don't care about this county. Or the opposite side, like people raising criticism and voices about it, like they're lunatics and they're hysterical, and they're just deranged, and they don't understand, and all that kind of demonized. So we went from just disagreeing about, I like plan A and I like plan B, to those who like plan A are crooked and evil. And those who like plan B are lunatics and heretics. It's just like the demonization. And guys, that's wrong. That's wrong. We can disagree with each other. That's part of the process of living together in community with a group of people. We can disagree with each other. We cannot demonize each other. It cannot take it to that level. And even if, and you're like, some people say, well, listen, we just don't have a difference of opinion. They're truly my enemy. I disagree with what they're trying to do with our community. They're truly my enemy. Okay, so they're your enemy. Jesus has something to say about that too. Jesus says, love them and pray for them. I mean, and that doesn't mean you have to be best friends with them. That doesn't mean you have to invite them over to dinner tonight and reconcile and get everything straightened out. It just means that you have to treat them, as you're discussing these things, with basic human dignity and common decency. You just have to respect. Their opinion may be different than yours. Their position may be different than yours. And you may debate it vigorously. But you got to treat them as a fellow human being created in the image of God that just wants what's best for their community, and that's what you want for your community. And so we're not going to demonize each other just because we disagree with each other. And I think we're losing our ability to do that. I think, like online, we're losing our ability to do that. And it's national stuff bleeding over into local stuff. And, like on a national level, the political left get labeled as anti-American and a threat to our way of life. And then the political right get labeled as fascist and a threat to our democracy. And you notice the language of threat. It's not just that they have a disagreement with us about the way our country ought to run or the things that ought to happen within our country. They are a threat to our very existence, a threat to our way of life, or a threat to our democracy. And what do you do with threats? You must eliminate them. See, that's where it gets dangerous, really fast. That's where it gets dangerous. And we stop treating each other as just human beings, all right? In a world where it's so, demonizing language is so commonplace that we don't even bat an eye when world leaders do it. We don't even bat an eye anymore. Like we used to, we would be shocked and appalled, like, oh, I can't believe they're saying that. But now we just go, that's just the way it goes. As Christians, we ought to be the ones that are at least going, Jesus would like a word. Jesus would like to, can we at least treat one another civilly and respectfully? And I'm not asking us to all agree, but I'm just asking us to treat, especially when it's people that are demonizing each other are both Christians. And that happens a lot in this society. Like they're fellow believers in Jesus, pointing out what the other one is doing wrong and saying they're against Christ and all this kind of stuff. And the Bible warns against this in all sorts of places, not just here about love for your enemies, but Peter talks about it and John talks about it. Paul talks about it. Paul's really direct about it, and Paul usually is direct about it. And Paul told the Galatians, if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. You know what was going on in Galatians? There was two groups of people. And they were both Christian. One of them were the Judaizers and one of them were the Gentiles. And the Judaizers said the Gentiles really need to be circumcised if they're going to become Christians. And the Gentiles said we don't have to be circumcised if we're going to become Christians because Jesus has done away with that old law. And they had a huge debate about that. But what happened was the Judaizers started demonizing the Gentiles and said they're not even real Christians. They're not even followers of Christ. They're enemies of Christ because they refuse to be to do this thing in regard to their obedience to Christ. And so Paul comes along and says, listen, I want to remind you of something. There was a man that we follow, that we get our name from, that told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And he said in Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, the entire law is fulfilled in a single command, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he followed it with that warning right there. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you'll be destroyed by each other. And that's a warning for us today as well. As a church, as a county, as a country. That's a warning for us today. I'll tell you a story real quick and we'll wrap this up because I'm running out of time. And I told the first service, I was like, it's kind of interesting. I feel like when I was teaching on Love Your Enemies 20 years ago, I would have probably chosen a church dispute as my example. Because church disputes, like we were fussing over everything. Like, can you have drums in worship? And can women pray? And I'm like, church is just fussing over just a little bit of everything. And so I probably would have chosen a church dispute. And churches still fuss. I don't want to act like, churches don't fuss anymore. Churches still fuss over stuff. But people aren't feeling the weight of church polarization as much as they're feeling the weight of kind of the community polarization, civic polarization. And so I want to use an example from there. This happened more than a decade ago, right? Because I don't use current civic examples because I'm too scared. So this happened more than a decade ago. And it was the first time that I was ever asked to speak before city council about an issue that a law they were looking at changing, or a rule they were looking at changing. And it had to do with predatory lending. So payday lenders, they were looking at enacting a distance requirement for payday lenders, that they had to be no more than a mile from each other. And at the time, we had 26 in Columbia. And our church had started a ministry called Pay Grace Forward. It's still going on. It's just we've spun it off into its own 501c3. And it was helping people caught up in predatory lending. And so Dean Dickey was the mayor of Columbia at that time, and he knew that we'd done that. And so he called and he said, hey, would you mind coming and speaking to the city council at our study session about why we need to have a distance requirement and limit the number of payday lenders in our community? I said, sure. Yeah, everybody ought to be for this. Everybody wasn't for it. Okay, so I showed up, city council meeting, had my prepared comments. I was nervous. There was another group of people there that weren't for it. And interestingly enough, it was a property rights debate, because property owners said, wait a minute, this is our property. We have a right to rent our buildings to people that we want to rent our buildings to. Like the city shouldn't be telling us who we can, that's a legal business. Well, they shouldn't be telling us who we can rent our property to and who we can't. So this is property right debates. So I stood up and I said my piece, and they stood up and said their piece. And nobody votes at the study session, so there was no vote or anything like that. And so at the end of that, Dean said, hey, if you're just here for this, you can leave. And I said, well, good. That's all I was here for. So I got up and I left, and I went to the elevator and punched the elevator, and I'm going to go up and head out the door. And another guy walked in the elevator right after me. And so there was just two of us on the elevator. He was on the opposite side of the issue. So I just spoke in support of it, and I don't think he spoke, but he was against it. He was on the opposite side. I knew he was on the opposite side of the issue, and he knew where I was because I just spoke. So he gets on the elevator with me, and you say, well, what happened? That had to be tense. That was a really tense elevator ride, because you guys are on the opposite side of this issue, and like, what happened? And this is why I haven't talked about it for 10 years, because I couldn't tell you about this. Here's what happened. He stuck his hand out, and I shook it. And he said, how you been doing, Russ? I said, I've been doing good. How you been doing? I'm not going to say his name. But how you been doing? And he said, oh, man, I've been doing good. How's your kids doing? Your little one playing softball still? Yeah, she's still playing softball. And we started talking about softball, and we started talking about Rotary Club that we were in together, because we knew each other. We were already friends with each other long before that issue came up. He wasn't my enemy. I mean, we just happened to disagree about one particular issue, but we knew each other and we respected each other. And in my opinion, he's one of the finest Christian men in our community today. I mean, I have much, much respect for him. He probably still disagrees with me about that issue. That's okay. We've agreed on far more than we have disagreed on. And that's the point. Just because we have a difference of opinion with somebody does not mean that we should divide from them. Just because we see an issue differently does not mean that we should then declare them as our enemy and have nothing to do with them and cast them as evil and wrong and corrupt. Just because we disagree does not mean that we should demonize. We have to stop that. The people of God have to be the ones to do that. And I'm not challenging us to go out today and get on Facebook and start going after everybody that's demonized and say, our pastor talked about this morning and you're doing what guilt. No, we're not. I'm not saying that. But can we at least stop liking it and sharing it? Can we at least stop looking at it? And I'll be totally honest with you. That's the hardest part. I'm off Facebook right now, primarily because of the story I just told you. Not the one about, the debates about growth and it getting nasty. And you know what I miss most about being off of Facebook right now? I miss the controversy. Just being honest. I miss the only thing I think, I don't miss like, oh man, people aren't getting to see my post right now. Ooh, they're lost. No, I don't miss any of that. But I'm like, man, anytime something happens in our community, I'm like, I wonder what people are saying about that. And I want to get on there and I want to read the comments. And I feel like I don't know what's going on anymore. I don't know. Are we still debating about growth? Because I hadn't seen it in a month, so I don't know if anything's going on anymore. And I feel like I missed and I'm just being honest. That's the hardest part. And the reason that's how Facebook draws us in. If it can keep us outraged and keep us engaged on controversy, and I know I'm picking on Facebook because that's the one I'm on. If it can just keep us going in that, keep us stirred up, keep us upset, keep us demonizing our enemies, all they care about's the ad revenue. I'm just being like they're not out trying to shape our society from a moral perspective. They just want to make money. And if they can keep us stirred up in that, but if we could learn how to say, I don't want to look at that stuff anymore, and I don't want to engage in that stuff anymore, and I certainly don't want to support that stuff anymore. I want to talk about Vanderbilt, Nebraska basketball, and how Vanderbilt should have won. I want to talk about the softball tournament this weekend, and how we should have won. That's what I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about all this fussing and fighting. So. Maybe there's a better way forward. I got to stop because y'all saw me fold up my notes. That means I'm going off the cuff. It makes me nervous. Let's pray. Father, I want to ask that you help us to do this. This is hard. Especially when it moves to personal stuff and like somebody has personally insulted us or somebody's questioned our character and our integrity or somebody's, like run down our family or something like that. It's hard for us to love our enemies. It's hard for us to treat them with kindness. And you're not telling us to be best friends with them, but you are telling us to treat them as fellow human beings, created in your image, and fellow human beings who your son died for. And so help us to keep that in mind when we're dealing with folks, and help us to be the kind of people who practice patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. Help us to be those kinds of people. And I ask that in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. All right. Last thing. Oh, I forgot giving real quick. I told Carter before the first service, I was like, if I forget giving, just wave your arms. All right. There's the information about giving. You can give online. You can give through text giving. You can give through the app, the tap tag in front of you. You can give as well. I want to say one thing about next week's sermon because some of you may be nervous about next week's sermon because it's got the word politics in it. So next week's called the glorification of politics. And you may be thinking, might be a good Sunday to skip. Because you're nervous, what's he going to say? Right? I'm going to go ahead and tell you our text so you can read it in advance and be ready. Our text is going to be the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and we're going to be talking about the politics of Palm Sunday, okay? Because it's Palm Sunday next week. We're going to talk the politics of Palm Sunday because what Jesus did when he entered on the donkey, it's a pretty political thing that he did. And we're going to talk about his conversation with Pilate right before he goes to the cross. So if you're worried about next week going, oh goodness, is he going to talk about Trump, or is he going to talk about Obama, or is he going to talk about Biden, or is he going to talk about Bush, or anything? No, we're not talking about any of that. We're mostly going to talk about Jesus like we always do. So don't fret it. We're going to talk politics, but we're talking about Jesus and what Jesus had to say in regards to politics. And then we're going to wrap this series up on Easter. And we're talking community. And we're going to tie it in with the resurrection. We're going to celebrate the resurrection. We're going to talk the gospel, all that kind of stuff. But on Easter, the church, all this division, the church has an incredible, incredible opportunity in the midst of all this political division. Incredible opportunity. Because we're the people who still get together with other people once a week and sit down face to face and get a cup of coffee and have conversations with them and like have potlucks and stuff. Like, we're the weird people in today's society. We don't just see people across screens. We still get together. We still have small group meetings and invite people into our homes and have a meal together. That's a huge opportunity in today's culture. Huge opportunity, especially for those ones that walked out the door at the beginning of this sermon. Huge opportunity to teach them how to engage with others, not just on screens, but face to face and in community. And when you do that, you're going to have some disagreements with them. But that's okay, because we agree on Christ, and that's what matters most. So I'm not going to preach my Easter message just yet, but I'm gearing up. All right? That's all I got. Oh, you guys hope to see you next Sunday for Palm Sunday, and start inviting somebody to Easter. We'll see. Oh, we got baptism. Who's getting baptized? You getting baptized? This gentleman right here is getting baptized. Y'all are welcome to come.